Hello, and welcome to Conversations at the Washington Library. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Stoltz. In this episode, we are going to feature an interview between Dr. Doug Bradburn, the now president and CEO of Mount Vernon, not just the director of the library anymore. Dr. Bradburn is going to be interviewing Dr. Gordon Wood, emeritus professor of history at Brown University. In many ways, Dr. Wood requires very little introduction. Most people that have read about the early American history within the past 50 years have probably encountered Dr. Wood's work in some way or another. And in this episode, the two of them are going to be discussing Dr. Wood's 50-year career as a historian and how the nature of historical scholarship has changed in those past 50 years.
All right, well, welcome everybody. This is Doug Bradburn. I'm the director of the Washington Library here at Mount Vernon, and I'm joined now by Gordon Wood, a famous professor from Brown University who's won every award for his historical work. It stood astride the field for the last 50 years in early American history, and I'm delighted to say he's here at Mount Vernon giving the last of 3 lectures, the Gayhart Gaines Lecture Series. So, Gordon, welcome to Mount Vernon.
Glad to be here.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. The last 2 lectures were received, I think, to great acclaim by the audience. You have a friendly audience here at Mount Vernon.
That's right. They're always friendly here.
Do you remember your first trip to George Washington's estate?
You mean as a lecturer?
No, as a human being.
Well,
as
actually,
a tourist, or
I probably came 20 years ago as just a visitor. But no, I remember coming here giving a lecture on George Washington, probably 15 to 20 years ago.
What do you think of the new library?
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
For having fellows and so on, it's given a kind of educational cast to the whole the entire institution, which I think was much needed.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, I think so I've been here 4 years now, and the library is going strong. And there weren't many fellowships probably when you were coming up as a graduate student in the same way there are now.
There were none of the sort that now exist throughout the country, really.
Yeah, you had you won the big. I guess, is it called the fellowship or it's something at the William Mary at the Omohundro Institute?
Right. It was called the Institute at that point, and that was 1964. A 2-year fellowship, which was very rewarding. You overlapped. We had 2 fellows, so it was always fun. Yeah. And there's a congregation there of early Americanists that makes for a nice community of scholars.
And so when you were there, you were working on your book, The Creation of the American Republic.
Correct, which was my dissertation.
Was it still a dissertation then, or was this a postdoc fellowship?
It was a postdoc. I had finished the dissertation, but and the arguments stayed the same, but I filled it out, enriched it in those 2 years.
Well, it got long, that's for certain.
Well, it was always long.
I don't think presses allow people to write books that size.
It was long even as a dissertation.
Now, you and I have personally talked about this before, but I don't know if it's been recorded. But what's striking, I think, to a lot of people who understand that period was that, Bernard Bailyn was working on his Origins of the American Revolution. He'd done the pamphlets and the introduction to the pamphlets. But you were sort of working on your own, not, you're not sort of following along what he's doing at that time.
No, I didn't know. I heard his lectures, but I didn't know what he was doing. I was working off of the notion. I started with the state constitutions, which he had suggested actually in a lecture, saying there isn't really a good book on the state constitution making. So I started with that, and I did a lot of research around 76, 77. And then I decided, well, maybe I should look into what happened 10 years later with the federal constitution, just to see if anything had changed. Because I had this notion, which really came from Bailyn. He says, you want to see how it changed through time. You start point A and you look at point B farther along in time, and you say, what happened? What's different?
But he has that great essay in defining a historical problem.
Right.
You have to find some disconnect
and
in the record. Yeah.
What I found was that the arguments around 1787, 88 were very different from the ones in 76. So suddenly I had my problem.
There you go.
How do you get from A to B? Why did things change? And that became the dissertation.
That's a brilliant, the essay, I don't remember it now. Maybe it's on the Historian's Craft or something like that he wrote. But that notion of finding a historical problem out of the records is such a key thing to to find a project. And I think a lot of graduate students go into it nowadays sort of starting with really coming at it from the wrong angle. You know,
Right.
they need to find a problem before a thesis.
Right.
You know. So that evolved. So that's really fascinating to hear. So that's how you defined your problem, and then you decided to read every pamphlet.
I
on
just
demand.
read everything that was available, and it can be done.
Yeah.
Because that was not. There was an explosion of things, of course. When you looked at the bibliography that exists, I've forgotten the name of it now, that goes from 1637 to 1800.
The Evans.
The Evans
bibliography. Early American imprints.
65% of all the publications between 1637 and 1800 occurred in the last 35 years of the 18th century. Between 1765 and 1800,
that's the
75% of everything. It was an explosion of publications, obviously coinciding with the revolution.
And so, I mean, all of us, I think, want our first books to be these, transformative in their way and influential. I mean, could you anticipate at all?
I had
the
no
impact?
anticipation of the republicanism taking off.
Yeah.
It really benefited from the politics that I had no awareness of, from the politics of the left and from the right. From the right, of course, there was the founding, and this is republicanism, and they looked back to antiquity, and they thought that this was natural law being fulfilled and so on.
Yeah.
But from the left, people were looking for an alternative to Marxism, which seemed to be dead. And here we have Madison et al.
And also an
offering
alternative to
republicanism.
rampant individualism, right?
Well,
wanted
they were
something
countering the liberal individualism, the Louis Hart's problem.
Right, yeah.
And so you have now republicanism, which puts an emphasis on the public good, the communal good. And I had law professors and political scientists getting in touch with me, telling me that I was their savior. I was going to save their, and this was from the left and from the right.
Yeah.
So it was an incredible moment. And republicanism went on for, a decade, 2 decades, and then finally died of its own weight. It was just it's a monster that was taking over.
Yeah. Now it became really scholastic. I had the misfortune of being in graduate school at the time where I had to learn all the different versions of republicanism between Pocock and Gordon Wood and all these other republicanisms. And I know that the people, yourself, you weren't of that school.
No.
You were never trying to define a type
certainly
of
Balin
Republican.
and I had no awareness that we were concocting anything like this monster that was running the. And I'm not sure John Pocock did either. But at any rate, it was picked up by people, and they began finding republicanism everywhere.
Yeah.
And well into the 19th century, it became a big thing until it just died, and then it was taken over by race, class, gender.
Yeah, but for a while there, it was republicanism, and then the study of ideologies more generally became a very potent way to sort of understand. Well, it was a way to connect the social with the intellectual ideologies.
Right. Well, Balin's book,
yeah.
The Ideological Origins of the Revolution, had a profound influence. But then people turned against that because it seemed to be all ideas and there was no substance.
Yeah.
I don't think that was true. I think Balin simply, he was writing about the ideas, but he wasn't arguing that only ideas mattered.
Yeah.
But that's the way the
all you had to
profession
do is
operates.
look at some of his other work to recognize that he was interested in social history.
Of course, that's right.
So fascinating. So you've been here at Mount Vernon and you've given a series of lectures looking at the founding and somewhat trying to think about it as a transformative event.
Oh, yes, I think it was. I think it's the most important event in American history, bar none, because it created, not only legally created the United States, but it created almost everything we believe in and highest aspirations and our noblest ideas. But I think it also made changes in the society, and as I've talked in these lectures, one lecture was on equality, which is the most potent ideological force in our history. The second was on the private-public distinction, which I don't think has been focused on very much by historians.
Yeah.
And then the third is on the origins of capitalism, which I think comes out of the revolution too. So I think it was a very transformative event.
Yeah.
I mean, the world is very different after 1800 than it was before.
That course came through most powerfully in your work, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. 1991 was the original
92.
publication date? 92. Give me a break. I mean, what did dates
that was
matter?
close, right.
Come on. And it's had a powerful impact, certainly. But that book, in that sense, very similar to these lectures in which you're kind of positing a pre-revolutionary world, dominated by monarchy and the hierarchies of monarchy and the kind of the assumptions of the way the world should work that get sort of overthrown. By the end of the period, you've got whole different understandings of how things should be.
Right. No, I these lectures I've drawn from that work that I did for the Radicalism book.
But expanded in the Empire of Liberty book, I think,
Right,
through the
right.
political changes of the 1790s.
Yeah, I think it's essentially a middle-class revolution, and I noticed that Alan Taylor has actually conceded that point in his big survey, the recent narrative history he wrote of the revolutions.
Right.
And I'm not sure that other scholars seem to deny any transforming effect, but he seems to accept that notion, and I think that's true. The revolution really did make a difference. Now, some people will say, well, like capitalism, it would have happened anyway. People say that about what happened in France, but we can never know, since the revolution can't be taken out of the process. It's all part of it, and therefore I think the revolution is very much a part of what transformed the.
Well, some scholars who would deny sort of the, in your phraseology, the radicalism of the American Revolution, they would say, maybe I'll paraphrase, is that this was the revolution, the war for independence was a settler revolt of these settler colonies, and it really it didn't change much. Basically, these settler colonies becoming states wasn't much different from the colonies in the British Empire, and demographics say that they were just going to keep expanding across the continent, and you would have ended up with, Canada basically writ large.
Well, that may be so. We'll never know. Certainly, demographically, the colonies were expanding at a fantastic rate, and there were things happening that overwhelmed, in a sense, the colonial rebellion. That somehow that's an incident in the process. That's not the revolution. This break from Great Britain, there's a momentous kind of demographic force that's operating, and that probably would have occurred anyhow. That was happening, which played into the revolution, which gave it a kind of impetus that it otherwise would not have had, and transcended the kind of debate, so to speak, the imperial debate.
Yeah, the constitutional debate over who's in charge.
Well, yeah, but then you have the emergence of middle-class people who are asserting themselves in ways against this elite that frightened elitists that led to the formation of the Constitution. In that sense, I accept the progressive interpretation of the Constitution. It is
going back to the creation of the American Republic. You make that case. I mean, you're making a case about a kind of reaction against.
Well, that's why I had
licentiousness.
I had people from Wisconsin schools saying that. Well, was I with them or not? Merrill Jensen,
another person who studied the state constitutions.
Yeah, well, he actually questioned me because he reviewed the book and he was puzzled because he thought I was a Balin student. I had to be an idealist, and he says, I just want to know one thing. He says, are you with me or against me? And I said, Merrill, I'm with you all the way. And he was puzzled by it because I did suggest a social component, which I unfortunately, Bud Baylor's never accepted that part of my interpretation.
Well, we can't all agree, I guess.
Right.
Fascinating. So all right. So we're separating out the war and the revolution. So the revolution is bigger, broader than the war for independence. It's bigger than the constitutional conflict. And of course, a lot of historians, scholars, I mean, you think of going back to Jack Green's early work and Emory Evans and some others will say the revolution is a constitutional event. That's it. Stop with all this other. It's not a social movement. But you seem to go back to the J. Franklin Jameson kind of.
Definitely.
Yeah. And did his work influence your?
No, because he was so slight. I mean, he only had suggestions here and there, but certainly he was on the right track.
Yeah.
All you have to do is study. One of the problems was that the way the profession was divided up, people were either colonialist revolution or they were early republic.
It's still a problem. Yeah.
And therefore, they didn't know much about the world that emerged in 1800. Now, once you taught both, as I did, then I realized, boy, I'm into a new, it's a whole new territory.
Yeah, how do we connect those literatures of the 19th century and the colonial period to have them make sense? And you still have that problem in the field in which the academic training is so narrow, but then you do teach more broadly.
Right.
And it would be nicer to see more projects that try to
Well, I think
cross the
that's why
divide.
this joint publication of the
Yeah.
Journal of the Early Republic and the William and Mary Quarterly is interesting because they're trying to somehow bridge the gap.
Now, you were involved in the creation of SHEAR, right? In the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic.
Right. I went to a meeting with back
you found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time.
No. It's the who's the guy who's done a blank on his the secretary, the first secretary.
Right, yeah.
He was a undergraduate at Harvard and was devoted to history, and he went on to organize SHEAR. He's the moving force, so I watched him. He's now recognized as the founder. Of SHEAR.
And you had an early essay that had an impact, I know, on a lot of scholars, was about the importance of the early republic.
Well, that's why I was
When it was your
one of the
presidential
presidential lectures, and so that
And what do you recall that? Or
Well,
what was your argument? Why does the early republic matter?
Well, because I think it is a realization of what the revolution was about, and what happened is I think you began to have a number of books that transcended the usual periodization. Usually people thought in terms of politics, and so you had 1776 to 1787, 1789 were cutoff dates, maybe even 1800, but suddenly people were talking about going from 1750 to 1840.
Right.
And you began looking at large-scale...
John Brooke had a great study, I think, of some county in...
Right, well, he came late to that, because there were many that preceded him that actually were opening up this notion that there was a great transformation. And, of course, that's how society changes over long periods of time.
Yeah.
We can see that when you're...
because there's always been that false argument about the revolution in terms of if it was a social revolution or not, and if it was a social revolution, how come you don't get some kind of immediate change in class structure with independence? And
well, actually, you had quite a radical change in some extent. That's what scared people so much.
Yeah.
But surely, any big cultural changes take time.
Generational.
We can see them. I mean, I've lived long enough to realize that the difference between 1950, the 50s, and the 2017 is enormous.
What's the immediate thing that somebody, who's the guy that sleeps through the revolution?
Rip Van Winkle?
Yeah, so if Rip Van Winkle fell asleep in the 1950s and woke up in 2017, what would they? What would the immediate thing that they would
I used that Rip
recognize
Van Winkle to open the Empire of Liberty, because I think that's what that's what people felt.
Yeah,
and that's why it
what was
became the
going
most
on.
popular of Irving's short stories and a play, and used over and over again because they were experiencing it. You wake up and it's George Washington instead of George III on the tavern sign. And there were political parties, Federalists, Anti-Federalists. He's bewildered by that.
it just didn't make any sense at all.
Right.
I think that your work, more than any other, certainly captures or attempts to grapple with that. Currently, there's a lot of, we talked about Taylor's revolutions with an S. There's multiple revolutions. Is that a concept that makes sense to you,
Well,
or do
I
you
can
find
see
it less useful?
No, it's useful. You show that there are other things going on at the same time in the New World. But they're not comparable to the American Revolution in their impact. Something that the Haitian Revolution was important for the Haitian people and for, I suppose, for blacks in Latin America. But compared to the American Revolution, it was small potatoes. And of course, we Americans didn't recognize the new state until the Civil War, because it was a black republic, even though it was the second republic in the New World.
Well, it does seem to be an interesting question about how we're defining the revolution and this in early American history more generally. Is early American history not going to be connected to the national? Is it sort of pre-U.S. history or not? If it's not pre-U.S. history, then it seems it could be anything.
Well, I think you can actually expand it, although Taylor doesn't do that. You can bring in the French Revolution, because actually I had a note from an email from a scholar at Florida State who works on the French Revolution, and he's written a new book on the private-public distinction and the breakdown.
Excellent.
And he found he had read my book, And he said, wow, we got something in common. And so there actually may be something that has to do with the movement to modernity, from a pre-modern to a modern society that is shared by both Americans and the continent and France. So if we could begin to link up, I actually wrote a paper, which has never been published, on comparing the French Revolution to the American Revolution, finding the similarities. I hadn't realized that the public-private was a crucial.
Interesting.
And this scholar, whose name now escapes me, but he teaches at Florida State, found something in my book that resonated with him. His book has just come out, and I think that should be explored. Instead of just looking at Latin America, think about the whole revolutionary era, the Western world, so to speak, experiencing. Which
So
then
sort
the
of
revolutions
the Palmer
become
Gaucher kind of
exactly.
vision, right, of this
But
big.
they didn't go far. I mean, they saw similarities. Palmer's book is fantastic when you think about it, because he's working with a historiographer. He knew nothing about the American Revolution. He had to teach himself. He was working with a historiography that ran against his thesis, that Robert Brown and so on, denying that there was any revolution.
The French in particular, too.
And I thought that he did a marvelous job. It was one of the great books, and should still be read, I think, because he captures the common element that took
The
place.
ambition is extraordinary, that work. So I first met Bernard Balin. I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, working with Ted Cook, who you know well.
Right.
Balin had this Atlantic seminars that he was doing.
Right.
And graduate students will go where the money is. So I went, get some money, go to Harvard for a couple of weeks, but it was incredible. The theme was Atlantic revolutions, so it had scholars from all over, the Atlantic world, basically, all working on their own little revolutions. But the idea was to sort of get people comparing and contrasting. And I think that the comparing and contrasting is a great exercise to understand, what's possible in one space and what's not in another.
The problem, of course, is the specialization that we have, and it's difficult for someone to work up
to be
too
good
many
enough.
fields. I mean, how many revolutions can you comprehend? And I think that was
barriers
one of well, that too. But I mean, Palmer was working with a much smaller historiography.
Exactly.
Nowadays, you'd have to read hundreds of books actually to give any kind of picture of what's going on in France, as well as what's going on in Poland or Britain or Italy, and then of course Latin America and North America. I mean, suddenly you've got an overwhelming problem, and that, I think, inhibits the comparison. But I think this French-American is something to explore.
Well, let's pause then and think about this public-private distinction that you brought up in your second lecture. So for people listening at home, what is the big deal with the public-private distinction? What is it?
Well, it's very hard to explain it short.
That's all right. Yeah.
I mean, I think you have the emergence of a public sphere that we've now been picking up from the political scientists that didn't exist before. When you look at how government was handled in the colonies, for example, it was essentially privatized.
Right.
People, if the city of New York wanted to have its streets cleaned, it simply passed a mandate. Each citizen, each resident must clean the streets in front of his home or his shop. And there were no public works departments or anything of that sort. So you had a privatization of things. The public, the government was very weak financially, but not legally. So it it created corporations to do things, gave a group of people the legal right to do certain things. Whether it's to run a college or to run a bridge, so to build a bridge or run a toll road or whatever. So everything was handled that way, and government was handled as a kind of private. You kind of owned the job you had,
right.
and everything was no records were kept of votes. Even when you were elected to a colonial legislature, you didn't know what your representative was doing. He didn't make any speeches that were available. You couldn't know. You didn't hear any debates, and you didn't even know the votes. All of that changed with the revolution. Suddenly, you have galleries built so that people could come in and listen to their representatives.
Was it the idea that the people should be in charge?
Yeah, well, a whole series of little things, all driving with that point, that the people should have some say.
Right.
And that, of course, is what we've been doing ever since. I mean, democracy is that. And it's very hard to ratchet back from that.
Well, I think that, and the point about corporations is a really crucial one, and I guess it'll be related to the rise of capitalism tonight. But this idea that, and Pauline Maier did some early work on this, in the corporation and the revolution, where you go from this corporate entity that's intended to do a public thing to something that every individual can incorporate.
Right. I mean, you have general incorporation laws
Yeah.
eventually, so that anyone can get incorporated.
Yeah.
How you get from one to another is a fantastic story.
Yeah.
And it's been told. Oscar Hanlon did some very important work on that. But that's just part of this larger transformation took place, going from a private world to a public world, or vice versa. I mean, it's a very complicated story, but it's the same thing as occurring in France. According to this scholar whose book has just come out. If I'd known we were going to talk about this, I would have looked it up.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's fine.
But at any rate, he's making the same point about France, where the offices are no longer being thought of as belonging to a private person. There was that tendency to think of the office the way the throne belonged to the king. Suddenly everybody else regarding their offices as belonging to them too. That has to change under the transformation that took place between the late 18th century and the early 19th century. And that's part of a transformation that we would call the emergence into modernity, I guess, one way of putting it.
Well, modernity and the thinking about the coming of modernity was a very popular in the late 70s, maybe a little earlier.
Modernization, you mean?
Yeah,
theory?
modernization theory. Well, and also modernity, and thinking about what that is, and finding
Right.
It never seemed to kind of take over the early American field. Now we're talking about post-colonialism, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, we go with the fashions.
Yeah. All right, so now after the radicalism, you did more books that are what we would call maybe in the biographical genre.
Right. Right.
What made you get interested in biography?
Well,
because the other two are such sprawling. One's a sprawling intellectual study, and then the other one.
I'm not quite sure, but I guess I realized that a lot of people wanted to read about these people, so I decided to. I had written for the New York Review of Books. I had been doing reviewing for 25 years, and I had accumulated a whole series of essays on each of the major founders.
Right.
And so suddenly I had a publisher who was interested in this, and so I didn't have to do much. I just had to take those essays and tease them a little bit and put them into an essay form on Adams, Jefferson, Franklin, so on.
It seems like in the 1990s, I mean, obviously books on the founders have always been with us, but it does seem like in the 1990s
there was an explosion.
You get a boom of them, right? And
Joe
you get
Ellis
this
was
great
doing,
success of Joe Ellis. Rick Brookhauser has the things on
and
Hamilton,
McCullough
Jefferson,
was doing
Washington.
His Adams and so on.
Yeah, right.
And you realize, I realized that this has become a major problem, the division that's occurred, which is really unprecedented. Back in the 50s, when I came of age, there was no great gap between what you might call the historians who wrote for the general public and the scholars. I mean, you talk about Hofstadter and Borston and C.V.N. Woodward. They wrote for two readerships simultaneously. Yeah. I remember being asked in my orals about the age of reform, Hofstadter's book. Yeah. Well, it was also a book that sold widely among the general public. That's no longer so. The historians become quasi-scientific. The monographs talk to each other. It's so specialized that a layman cannot really read articles in the William and Mary Quarterly any longer. It depends on what else is read before. Yeah. And as a consequence, they're writing, the historians, the academics, I would call them, are writing for each other in a kind of quasi-scientific way, or advancing the discipline.
Way,
well, they're advancing the discipline. There's no doubt that the discipline is much more complicated than it was earlier.
Sophisticated work.
Right, exactly. It's a good thing, but it does tend not to appeal to the general public. And as a consequence, there are these people who are not scholars, who have no PhD and have no academic position, who are writing the books that are being read by hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, the barriers to entry are lower for those journalists and others to come into the founding era because a lot of the accessibility of the sources of the founders' papers, projects, and others. I bet it's a lot easier than it was in the 50s for a journalist to all of a sudden decide, I'm going to write a book on John Adams.
Well, there were a few back then, but not too many. Bruce Catton, I think, and who was the woman who was...
Barbara Tuchman.
Barbara Tuchman. Those were the two dominant forces. Now you have, our field alone, early American history, I named 20. There's an article I published in the Massachusetts Mass Historical Society publication pointing this out, about 20 men and women who have no academic connection, no PhD, are dominating the publications. And they're being read. And this, I think, is lamentable, but it's understandable.
There's no doubt. I mean, we don't have to name names, but there's certainly some bad history that they're selling the most history books out there. And it's that
some of that popular history, right?
It's
but some of it's very good.
It's very good.
Chernov's biography of Washington is first rate.
It's a definitive study. I mean, it was intended to be that. When I talked to Ron about what he was trying to do with that book, he would even admit that it's a hard book to read sometimes because he wanted to make sure every story was in there.
Right.
So it's everything in the kitchen sink. But it's a definitive study based on the latest, the Papers of George Washington Project at UVA and all that. And it's astonishing when you see some popular books that still are using like the writings of Washington. This stuff, they're not using the latest sources, and they're just finding things here and there. So you can pretty much spot them very quickly. What are going to be the good ones?
Right.
But I mean, on the other hand, I mean, it does seem like I think it's somewhat of a golden age for history writing. I mean, there's more.
There's more history books being published now than ever before.
Yeah. I mean, it's easier to get a history book published than probably it was.
It's amazing how many history books are read and how many people are interested in history. But the scholars are not meeting that audience because they've got different questions in mind. And as they would say, we're advancing the discipline. And that's true enough. But it is certainly not the history that's being read.
Well, I think that a lot of us scholars and would love to write a great bestseller. I mean, it's not like they're against selling books. It's just that they have a hard time making that leap. You're trained as a graduate student in with such a heavy dose of historiography, at least in the American style. There's such a heavy dose of historiography as a way to define the purpose rather than finding a historical problem and making a story.
Well, I was blessed in that I was asked to review books for the New York Review, and obviously the New York Review readers are not, they're intelligent, they're educated people, but they're not necessarily scholars. And so Bob Silvers was a genius, and he would tell you, you've got to reach this educated reader. And so you had to write in such a way, and that was wonderful training.
It was good help for you, and you see that in your writing now.
I think, although he picks people just because he likes the way they write. He did pick people. I mean, whether his successor will be as successful, we'll see. But Bob was a genius. That journal.
In those reviews, what was your goal in those reviews?
First of all, I wanted to explain the book. You don't want to write a review that doesn't make sense, tell you what the book is about. But at the same time, because you had 4,000 words to work with, 5,000 words to work with, you could build a context for the book. And
so you felt like you wanted to make a kind of an analytical argument.
Right, of course, and you wanted to, but you also had to have it readable and make sense to an educated but not a scholarly reader. And that is, I think, what at least I find myself blessed because I had to do that. And that became,
so are you still writing for the review then, or are we not sure yet?
You wait until the new editor hasn't asked me to. They haven't reviewed anything but who knows? I mean, he'll have his own people in his collection of writers, but they seem to be doing some of the same older people. A lot of Englishmen, because Englishmen and Bob Silver's always thought they wrote better than Americans. But I don't know whether they're trained to write to a general public in a way that we aren't.
Yeah.
But somehow he just plucked me out. This is 1980 or so. So his first review I did.
Oh, wow.